remember this because I recall going to the library to look up USO work. And I read an article there written by Frank Weil, who was president of the National Jewish Welfare Board. Now, when I came in there, into this room, there was the executive vice president, the president, personnel director sitting there, and they were asking me all kinds of questions about my Jewish background and stuff like that, which wasn't much to talk about. And finally, the president sitting there said, his name was Frank Weil, I remember, I asked me, what do you know about USO? I said, all that I know about USO is what I read in an article that you wrote. I mentioned the journal and the date. That made it. I was hired on the spot.
Really? That's funny.
And there was a period of training. They sent us to Fort Dix, where they taught us all about Army regulations, how to recognize the difference between a captain and a major and a lieutenant, a colonel, and so on, and who is saluted and who's not saluted, and when you want something done, whom do you go to? And one thing we learned is that a civilian has the same rank as a general.
Really?
That's right. You see, a lieutenant can't go to the general. He can't, if he wants something, he can't go to the general. He's got to go to his next commanding officer. There's a pecking order in the Army, and it's a society that is very well regulated. You know the situation of any individual by looking at his shoulder. You know exactly what his role is in life in the Army. But with a civilian, you don't know that. As a USO worker, I could go anywhere. I'd go directly to the general. You see, I didn't have to observe protocol, in other words.
Yes.
So these are the things we were taught. And he said, and they said this, there's one thing you must remember, and that is that while the National Jewish Welfare Board passes on chaplains, there's any rabbi who has to serve has to be approved by the board. And we don't have many chaplains because the percentage of Jews in the Army is a reflection of the percentage of Jews in the general population. Therefore, the number of rabbis or Jewish chaplains is going to be far fewer than the number of Catholic chaplains. Therefore, you may find yourself in a position where there is no Jewish chaplain on the base. You may have to assume that role. And that is not something that a Catholic worker might have to do, because there are enough Catholic chaplains to go around, but not enough Jewish chaplains. So, and then it was our responsibility to give support to the Jewish chaplain, to be his representative vis-a-vis the Jewish community. So when he needed people for Friday night services, let us say, to be there from the community, to serve bagels and cream cheese or whatever it was, we were the ones who had to go and get the community organized to serve his needs.
Now, this is where is all this happening? Are we in Panama at this point?
No, not yet.
Okay.
No. We're still in New York for the training.
I see. Okay.
When we got the training, after we got the training, then I was shipped off to Fort Meade was my location, and that was Laurel. And I had to serve the men on that base.
Ah, that's how we got to Maryland, Laurel, Maryland.
That's how we got to Laurel, Maryland, right.
Okay. And then what?
Well, then we got to Laurel, Maryland. I was indoctrinated, and I began to organize activities. Now, the other people in the club, you see, they had a number of USO clubs. This club that we had in Laurel, Maryland was called a joint agency operation, which meant that we had a representative there from the National Jewish Welfare Board, that was me. We had someone from the YMCA, which was designated as the operating agency. They had the responsibility to take care of the building. We had the YWCA and the Catholic organization, and we had someone from the YWCA. All of us were the staff. Now, in addition to my programming responsibilities, I had to also go into camp very frequently. The other workers did not have that responsibility. The other workers, they simply were in the club because there were enough chaplains there. They didn't have a responsibility of a relationship with the chaplain. My responsibility also included that. So when I got there, I immediately started to expand the programming that was going on there. When I got there, we had a skating club, skating day, evening, and one evening was a dance, and that was about all. I began to introduce small group activities, classes, and all kinds of things, because I said to, I would go into the camp and speak to some of the commanding officers, and I say, ultimately, these guys, the war's going to be over, and these young men are going to go out, and they're going to need jobs. So let's expose them to all kinds of educational activities, and they said, fine. One day, a man's car broke down in front of the USO Club. So I went out and I helped him change a tire. I think it was a flat tire or whatever it was. And we got to talking, and I found out that he was a teacher of poultry husbandry at the University of Maryland. I said, listen, I said, you're at the University of Maryland, you're not far from here. I'd like to know whether or not you'd like to volunteer to teach a class in poultry husbandry at the club. Oh, he said, by all means. I said, it'll only be once a week. Fine. I went into camp, and there was a pigeon signal company there. I went to the commanding officer. I said, listen, I'm starting this class in poultry husbandry. These guys are working with pigeons. And there's a proximity between their experience here and poultry husbandry. Let's expose them to. Oh, great! So he provided a truck once a week. He provided a truck, and a truckload of these guys would come in, and there were chickens all over the club. And the operating agency at YMCA, Mr. Williams, he was a very particular guy. As a matter of fact, when the dances occurred, he didn't even like dances because they would scrape on the floor. He likes everything polished. So when the chickens were there, he didn't like it too much, but after all, what could he say? So anyway, that was an activity. But we had all kinds of things, and we taught math. That was Ethel. Ethel Snyder, in town. She taught math. And I had
what about David? Did you meet David by then?
No, he wasn't there at the time. We knew her much before.
I see.
So in Laurel, there were the Snyders, Snyder family, and I organized what's called an Army and Navy committee in Laurel. And every Jewish, there were only about 10 or 12 Jewish families there, every family belonged to this committee. The shoemaker, the jeweler, the drugstore owner, the dry cleaning establishment, the Snyders, they all belonged to this Army and Navy Club, and they provided me with volunteers for Friday night. Friday night I had to bring out these people. But it wasn't enough, because it was every week. So I went into Baltimore, and I would bring in women from Baltimore to serve also. And during Passover, I would go into Baltimore, and the Orthodox women in the basement would prepare boxes with kosher Passover food. And I would go in every day to take these boxes, go to camp, and any serviceman who wanted kosher food, Passover food, would get it delivered to his bunk.
Wow.
And I would go through the camp and deliver these boxes of kosher Passover food for them. And this is part of our training. Our training was, even if a serviceman needs a toothbrush, whatever, let's do it. And that's what we did. We were dedicated to serving these guys, visited them in the hospital if they were sick, and so on.
Okay. Go ahead.
Now, one of the principles that I developed was, when a Jewish group worker is away from the center of Jewish cultural resources, let us say like New York or Chicago or any community like that, he has to make maximum use of the local resources. So, for example, I recall we had a lot of Orthodox Jewish kids in the army, and they insisted. They didn't want to use the JWB prayer books. There were special prayer books printed by JWB, approved by a joint committee of Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbis. But these Orthodox kids would have nothing of it. They insisted on a regular Orthodox prayer book, which has no English in it. And so I went into Baltimore and bought a big supply of Orthodox prayer books. And there was a time when a Jewish chaplain was shipped out, and there was no Jewish chaplain, so I had to take over. So what I would do is I would bring in rabbis from Baltimore. 1 week one rabbi, 1 week another. And I'll never forget, I invited Rabbi Lazarin. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Reform rabbi. And he came out to the Fort Meade, I remember, for a Friday night, and I said, the only prayer books we have are these. He says, oh, that's all right. So I said, most of our guys here are from the New York area. They're Orthodox kids. He says, it's okay. He conducted an Orthodox service with a yarmulke, and he used the Orthodox prayer books and so on. It just goes to show you that during the war, people forget their differences. And that's exactly what happened. Tremendous upsurge of voluntarism and so on, which you don't see today. So in any event, that was one thing that came out of that. That is this, and also what came out of the war, and it had an impact on me particularly, was a relationship with the other faiths. You'd come into a chapel, and in the front of the chapel was a big device right up in front. It was like a revolving stage. You press a button, and this thing revolves, and there is an altar for Catholics. You press another button, and this thing turns around, and there is an altar for Protestants. Press another button, and there is an altar with the Torah in it, and the altar for the Jews. And then you begin to develop a relationship with the Protestant ministers and Catholic priests and so on who are serving as chaplains. And the result is that you develop an appreciation of other faiths. You're in the hospital, you're going from bed to bed, and you're giving candy or something, whatever it is, to Jewish patients. But at the same time, next to his bed is another patient. He's maybe a Catholic. You're talking to him and so on. And along comes the Catholic chaplain, and you get to know him and so on. So serving in the place of a chaplain, see, normally the chaplain does that, and sometimes with me. I would also accompany the chaplain there. And many times I would be walking down the street with the Jewish chaplain. This was very, very interesting. We walked down the street in the Fort Meade, and the chaplain would see a soldier there. He says, "Hey, Private Goldstein." I said, "Yes, chaplain." He says, "I didn't see you at services. Where are you?" Goldstein responds. He says, "Rabbi, it isn't necessary for me to go to services. My knowledge of your presence, the fact that I know that you are here, that I can lean on you when I need it," he says, "for me, that's enough." That was a great answer. The mere presence, knowing the mere presence. So all of these things developed a spirit of understanding among all religious faiths there. So anyhow, going back to using indigenous resources. We were close to Washington, and a lot of the kids there from New York had never been to Washington. So I developed the idea of taking the kids, the soldiers, to Washington on a tour. We'd rent bicycles. We'd have little boxes with lunch we would prepare for them. And on the box said USO. And people would register for this. And these were all, there were Jewish kids, Christian, so on. Their wives who may have been around who came. We were all on these bicycles. And we would be riding down the street, 50 bicycles, men in uniform. And I'm there riding with them. And I arranged each week for this trip. I don't remember, I think it was each week. And we would wind up with a visit to one of the embassies. Every embassy. I would write to the ambassador and I'd say, I'd like you to host a group of servicemen for me. Yeah, of course. And the receptions were fantastic. They served. Come to the Danish embassy and they were proud. They said, now they said you will eat real Danish.
I think I saw a photograph of the British embassy.
Yeah, we were in the British embassy. I went with you I took you along on some of these things, and at the British embassy, this was terrific.
I was pregnant with Elise.
All the soldiers were around. They were talking to Lord Lady Halifax and so on, and their little dog was running around, and you were chasing the little dog around. You wanted to pet him or something. Finally, Lady Halifax picks up the dog. She felt the dog was being disturbed or something, and she held it on his arm. And you came to me and you asked me, why does the dog's mother pick him up when I want to play with him? So I was glad she didn't hear you say that.
You were 4 years old.
So in any event, we covered all the embassies that way, and we had a long waiting list of the soldiers who wanted to go on this trip. See, it was very, very interesting. And as a matter of fact, National Geographic took a picture of us and had an item about us in one of the issues of their magazine. So, Laurel, that was Laurel, and that was Fort Meade, and groups of men would come in, be trained, and shipped out. And I would be making the acquaintance of these guys, and then I'd be saying goodbye. And then another group of men come in, make their acquaintance, go by. And the spirit in the air was, it develops a sense of guilt. Because here, the guys, some of them are old as I am. So I was married with a child and so on. So
And one on the way.
And one on the way, so I was kind of semi-exempt. And so I said, gee, I ought to really volunteer for overseas service. It wasn't really overseas because USO had the Western Hemisphere for recreation activity, and the Red Cross had the Eastern Hemisphere. So if you wanted to do this kind of work, recreational work for men in the armed forces overseas, you would have to join the Red Cross. If you were in USO, you would be in the Western Hemisphere. So I volunteered, and I could have gone either to the Philippines or USO handle the Philippines to Panama and so on, but not Europe. So they assigned me to Panama, and that's how I got to Panama.
I see.
And that's how I rode in a plane for the first time.
Wow.
And that was a real experience. These little planes, propeller planes that took me to Miami, and then in Miami I took a Pan American seaplane that took me to Panama.
And that's where you organized all these exciting.
Yeah, when I got to Panama, I realized there were tremendous resources there, which were not being used. Again, it was a joint agency operation. The operating agency in this case was the Catholic Community Service. He was the administrator of the building, and all the rest of us were program people. And I used to stay up all night long working on these programs, developing the announcements and stuff like that, and making use of all of the facilities, all the resources. For example, there was a mental institution, so I organized a trip to the mental institution and get psychiatrists there to speak to us on the spot on some of the problems that people had in psychiatry.
What about the alligator hunt?
Well, that came later. And then there was a leper colony. I took people to the leper colony and they got an understanding of what leprosy is all about. There's an island in the middle of Gatun Lake with a biological preserve, and there's a big zoologist there who's in charge. Took them there and they learned all about the zoology.
I have a lot of stuff about it.
And then, well, and then of course there was this guy I met. His name was, people called him Jungle Jim, and he had a place up in the interior, a lodge, and people would come up there, and he would take them on an alligator hunt. I organized the alligator hunt in Cayucas.
And you visited the Sandblast Indians, I think.
And then another thing I did was to visit the Sandblast Indians on the archipelago of the Sandblast Islands. I chartered a boat and took the guys on this trip. And then once we went to on the East Coast, there's a little town called Portobello, which is isolated from the rest of Panama. No roads leading to it. The only access was by this boat, this milk boat. And they have a Black Christ festival there once a year to celebrate the finding of a black ebony statue of Christ. They built a church around it, and once a year they have this festival. There are no electric lights in the community, so there's a big procession, everyone carrying a big candle, and the procession moves in the form of a cross.
I see.
So you see the candlelights moving. Oh, that's all you see. You don't see the people. You see this procession of candlelights moving in the form of a cross. And the trip through the jungle to get to the place and so on.
And you organized bicycle trips across the isthmus.
Yes, I announced the fact that if you want to write home and tell your folks that you rode by bicycle from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, here is your opportunity.
Now, you'd already taken up bicycling by this time. I mean, I know you'd done some cycling
of course.
when you were younger.
Right, I had done that. I belonged to the American Youth Hostels Association.
And you cycled down to Philadelphia once.
Well, once I got up in the morning and just to take a little spin, and before I knew it, I was in Staten Island. And then when in Staten Island, I crossed the bridge and I was in New Jersey, and so little by little I said, well, it's a little further. I wound up in Philadelphia and put the bike on a train and came back to Penn Station and then drove back to Brooklyn by bike.
And then you cycled to the end of Long Island, I think.
No, well, what happened was that I cycled to Vermont, from Brooklyn to Vermont, stopping at youth hostels, and then on the way back came down through Massachusetts, came to Brockton, and they published an item about the local boy who comes back to visit his town on a bicycle. Then came down through to Connecticut, to London, to put the bike on a ferry, landed at Orient Point, and then from Orient Point cycled all the way back to Brooklyn.
Wow.
So it was a lot of cycling.
And you still cycle, don't you? Or you did until recently, I think.
Yes, I did until recently. Have to get back to it.
Yeah. Let's see. Getting back to you returned to Brooklyn, I think, after you left Panama.
Oh, I forgot to mention the fact that while we were in Laurel, a daughter was born to me, and
That's right.
You know,
to us.
to him.
And what happened was, and
I
I
was
was
at a meeting.
I was
He
at a
wasn't
meeting.
even
I was
there.
at a meeting in Baltimore, and when I came back, I was greeted at the club. They said, "You are the father of a daughter." She was born while I was at a meeting in Baltimore. And then I got all kinds of letters of congratulations from my colleagues all over the
I
place.
have them all. You are so wonderful letters.
So anyhow, that was Laurel. But then again, we finished with Panama. In Panama, what happened was the regional supervisor got himself an assistant. Her name was Lucille Sears, and she was a superannuated actress who had sort of retired from Broadway. Very nice looking woman. And when I learned about that, I went, and their office was located on the Pacific side. When I learned about that, I went over there and I said, "Listen, I'd like to start a little theater group in our place." In other words, I was always trying to make use of all of the local resources. For instance, I visited the various businessmen, asked them to give courses in banking or whatever it was. And I also organized special nights for the various countries, like China Night. I got hold of the Chinese consul and his wife, and I asked them to help us organize a China Night.
You saw a big picture.
And I did the same thing for other countries as well. And I used to frequent the nightclubs in Panama. You see, our club was located on the Atlantic side, and Cristobal is the name of the American, or the American side of Panama. The United States controlled two ends of the zone at that time, and one was Balboa. That was an American city, and its twin, Panamanian twin, is Panama City. And on the Atlantic side, we have Colon, is the Panamanian city, and its twin was Cristobal. The club was located in Cristobal. Of course, today, there is no such thing. It's all wiped out. And the thing, of course, which amazed me was the difference between the way Panamanians were treated, who came to work in the zone, in the canal zone, and the way Americans were treated. They had different windows in the post office. One was called a gold window and a silver window. And if you went into the commissary, you had the same thing. There's a gold section and a silver section. Everywhere you went in the canal zone, there was this distinction between the Panamanians and the Americans. Difference in wage scale, everything. Now, of course, that's been obliterated. But living in Panama was like living in a communist state, in a sense. Everything was government. Your house, the rent was paid to the government. Everything was government controlled. You went to a commissary run by the government. So the hospitals, everything, government.
Now, when you came back, you went to Brooklyn.
Yes. I was leaving, and the supervisor asked me to continue on for another year.